Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. This week, there are nearly 50 college football games, and we're one more week away from the rest of FBS joining the fray. COVID-19 disruptions are still providing some stress, especially in Wisconsin this week, but on Saturdays, the season is starting to feel more normal. On the show this week, we'll catch up with ESPN's Bill Connelly, the mastermind behind the SP Plus rankings. I am a big fan of his advanced metric, which uses play-by-play data to evaluate teams. We'll talk to Bill about what the numbers are revealing about this odd season. We'll look back at Penn State's upset at the hands of Indiana and figure out what it might mean for the Nittany Lions' chances to beat Ohio State this weekend. Which are some of the hardest teams to predict so far this season? Why is Kansas State breaking Bill's model? And are we looking at a really boring playoff race? Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, Apple Podcasts, just about anywhere you like to get your podcast. If you like what you hear, rate us and review us. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. And away we go. Joining me this week on the podcast is Bill Connelly from ESPN, the genius behind the SP Plus rankings. Bill, good to talk to you. It's been a little while. Always good to catch up with you. I like to catch up with you before the season because previews are definitely your thing, and we like to sort of take the temperature of the landscape of college football through your very complicated brain during the season as well. But of course, this is a season like no other season, so some of the season hasn't even started yet. How are you, Bill?
It's good. I just wrote a piece for ESPN Chalk about overachievers and underachievers, like teams that aren't doing what the spread thinks. But I had to break it into teams that have played 3 or fewer games, teams that have played 4 and 5 games, teams that have played 6+, because this is just we've known for a while this was going to be the strangest year ever, and it has been. Yeah, it really has. Well, actually, I've got a whole bunch of topics to hit on, but that's kind of an interesting little nugget right there. Betting is not all you do, but your metric, SP Plus, is really good for is a predictive measurement. And it does pretty well when it comes to predicting games. Though I feel like you've had like a little bit of a bumpy ride this season. So let me ask you that. How are you doing? How is SP Plus doing this season? It's not you. How are the numbers doing this season? And what'd you come up with as far as underperformers and overperformers? Yeah, it started off beautifully. I was at like 60, or SP Plus was at like 60% until about 3 weeks ago. Week 5 was weird. Then the last 2 weeks is one of those like just tip your cap to Vegas kind of things, because SP Plus has for 2 straight weeks hit every single marker that I track as far as is it performing how it should be, and it's been under 50% against the spread both weeks. So just tip your cap. The lines have been treacherous, and I guess you just have to admit when you've been defeated.
Can you glean anything from what you just talked about as far as comparing your numbers with Vegas and just the numbers in general to find how odd this season is? In other words, are you getting it's also still a relatively small sample, but are you getting any weirdness in the numbers that you could sort of say this think as a result of this being such a weird season? Can we extrapolate that?
Well, it's tricky, but I mean, I think one thing is, from a ratings distribution standpoint, everything looks pretty normal. BYU being in the top 10 is certainly weird, but Oklahoma's still 11th, but they're like just, a point and a half out of 6th. So that's, they're underachieving, but not really. So you look at the rankings, and aside from BYU and Cincinnati being pretty high, they kind of look like what you think. Wisconsin being 4th after 1 week is impressive. And of course now we'll see we'll see how they keep that up with their 12th string quarterback or whatever, if that rumor turns out to be true. But what's interesting is the ratings look normal, but the results themselves have been super funky, right? I mean, you've had a whole lot of top 10 teams losing to unranked opponents, not a 2007 level, but you've had Oklahoma falling a couple times. You've had Penn State falling. You've had Florida lost to A&M when it started to look like A&M wasn't going to be very good. We've had a lot of funky results in that manner. And I just wonder, the oddity of this season might just be that we dove right into conference play, and any weaknesses, any brief beginning of the season sloppiness, like what Penn State suffered against Indiana, where they just made a whole bunch of uncharacteristic mistakes in the first half, came all the way back in the second, and then took two of the flukiest plays ever to lose, or not fluky necessarily, but very low probability plays. Maybe it's what we're seeing is the effects of not having a non-conference to sharpen yourself up, and any flaws you have, any sloppiness you suffer at the beginning of the year gets punished much, much more this year than in previous years.
Let me talk about what happened with Penn State and Indiana. We're going to try to look a little forward here, but I am interested in the concept of losing a game where you're really not supposed to lose, or in Indiana's case, winning a game where everything sort of falls against it. And I think the reason why I get fascinated by games like that, because the emotional part of us is to crush Penn State, celebrate Indiana. And listen, results matter, right? It's a great story. It's great for Indiana. It's a terrible story if you're Penn State, but it's a great story if you're Indiana, that you've got this. You have the win that has made your season. No matter what happens this season, it will always be remembered for Michael Penix diving for the pylon and Tom Allen sort of outsmarting James Franklin, right? That's a signature moment for this football season, regardless, and it's one of the things that makes college football great. But I think when we step back from those crazy results, I think the rational side of our brains need to also be able to assess, what did I just see here? What does this mean going forward? So what did I just see there, Bill? And what does this mean going forward?
Yeah, this is I talk about this a lot, the difference between football and other sports. If it was a 3-game baseball type series between Penn State and Indiana, I think it wouldn't surprise anybody if Penn State won the next 2 games and came away from the quote unquote series feeling pretty good. Like, well, we lost a funky one, but then we looked good the other times. That's a good series in baseball, winning 2 out of 3. If it was a 7-game playoff series, they probably win in 5 or 6 from what we saw, because they don't commit the same level of penalties that we saw early on. They don't just suffer the same kind of sloppiness. And everything I'm saying, by the way, power to Indiana for not looking at sloppy and for taking advantage of Penn State's mistakes. So I don't want to make it sound extremely one-sided, but it wouldn't surprise anybody if that was the first game of a 7-game playoff series if Penn State went ahead and won in 5 or 6 games. And so that's what's different about football. What my goal with SP Plus was all along has been to try to filter out the funkiness and the randomness and try to measure that sustainability aspect, the things that in a game of football that are actually maintainable and sustainable from week to week. And what we saw from Penn State, Indiana, was Penn State slipped a smidge. They're now 8th in SP Plus. Indiana rose a little bit to 25th. But they're more or less they're very close to the same ratings we saw a week ago. It was just, it took a whole heck of a lot for Penn State to lose that game. And if they played again tomorrow, those same things probably wouldn't happen. So
Penn State plays a huge game this weekend, and that's a perfect way to start looking ahead a little bit. Huge game this weekend against Ohio State. It was, when the schedule comes out, or even, before the season, one of the cool things about college football is you sort of can look ahead, right? You sort of can go, okay, here's a major game. And sometimes they don't work out, but a lot of times it does. Yeah. And this feels lesser. It feels like a lesser game now, of course, because Penn State is coming in off of a loss. But the fact of the matter is the underlying, measurements of Penn State last week was a team that outgained its opponent by 277 yards, crushed their quarterback most of the day. I mean, Penn State looked on many levels, like a team that could challenge Ohio State. Now, Ohio State is on a whole nother level, and we'll get into that in a little bit too. number one in your rankings, even though they've only played one game. Again, it's a strange season, folks. Do you then, and let's almost like tie it to what you talked about with Vegas, do you then sort of look at this and say, okay, if I'm a betting person, I may have an opportunity here to maybe make some money on Penn State because they'll be undervalued. In general, like what does this matchup look to you? And do you think now our emotional side has sort of messed up what actually still is a good matchup? In other words, the emotions of this make us think this is lesser, but really Penn State is as good as we thought they were.
Yeah, I mean, there might be generally odds makers are pretty good at kind of filtering out that emotion too. So finding a good angle from a betting perspective, I'm not completely sure about. It looks like basically right now the lines are somewhere around Ohio State by 12.5. And I think SP Plus has it like something like Ohio State by 10.5. So it's about the same. Mm-hmm. But emotionally, you're absolutely right. Just look at the rankings. Penn State fell all the way to 18th in the AP poll this week. So now it's 3 versus 18. When I don't remember what Penn State was last week, but 6th or 7th, I think, maybe 8th. It dampens that. We assume Ohio State's going to kill them now, and they might, because Ohio State might be really good. But on paper, it's basically what we thought it was a week ago. And I mean, the offense, the Penn State offense, without Journey Brown, then without Noah Cain. I watched that dude play last year and I think, man, I really like Noah Cain. Then he gets hurt and then he gets hurt again. Then he starts the season and gets hurt again. So I haven't actually been able to watch him since deciding I liked him. But, Penn State's offense is maybe a little blurrier or a little less proven than we maybe thought it would be, especially in the run game. But their defense looked even better. They gave up 100 yards to Indiana in the first 3 quarters of that game. And at the end of the day, it was still only like 2-11, even though Indiana had the good drive after the accidental touchdown. So what we saw from Penn State, their defense might be even more capable of slowing Ohio State down, especially if Chris Olave is out, especially if what we saw from Ohio State's run game presents itself again. They weren't all that impressive against Nebraska, and Penn State's defensive front is definitely better than Nebraska's. You can kind of talk yourself into maybe this being a closer game than maybe we thought the moment the Penn State-Indiana game ended last week. I'm not completely convinced of that because I don't think I trust Penn State's offense, but I trust their defense quite a bit.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about that for a second because you sort of opened the door there. The path to a Penn State victory probably looks like Penn State's very good pass rushers and defensive and sort of front seven. Giving Fields a bit of a hard time, though. I don't know how much of a hard time you can give Justin Fields these days, and sort of tricking up or bunging up the Ohio State run game. Do you think that's the path to victory here?
Yeah, I think it has to be. And I mean, Ohio State's defensive front, Nebraska could be pretty interesting in terms of their run game and what they present to teams. So I don't want to say it was all Ohio State, but their defensive front was the biggest question mark heading into the year. And then Nebraska running for a lot of yards on them. So theoretically, if Penn State can move the chains a little bit, just keep even if they're not scoring a ton, just keep the field kind of tilted and making Ohio State drive 90 yards for touchdowns. Theoretically, even if you give up some 3rd and longs, which Justin Fields is very, very good at converting, you can still maybe hold them to field goals there. And so you play the ball control game, you play the field position game. When you get a red zone chance, you finish with touchdowns, hold them to field goals, and there you go. That's how you that's at least how you cover, and theoretically, it's how you win too.
It's definitely an unscientific and observation by my eyes. I always feel like when I watch, or the last year or so of watching Ohio State with Fields, what always seems to jump out at me is they seem to just pick up yards easily. They get easy, small chunks. Like all of a sudden he just sort of falls forward for 6 and now it's 3rd and 1 as opposed to 3rd and 7. And again, that's like a very sort of unscientific observation, but that seems to be their offense to me. It's remarkable how easily they pick up small chunks of yards.
And I think what you're describing is kind of one of the facets of having a totally like modern and efficient offense overall is just knowing all the ways to steal easy yards. Not on every play, but just, an easy 6 yards here. And then the next on the next possession, an easy 8 yards here, whether it's, little jet sweeps, whether it's just using motion, whether it's whatever, whether it's just having Justin Fields as your quarterback and having him escape pressure and wait for guys to come open, whatever it is, like that's what the best offenses do. That's what Michigan, I was actually impressed with what Michigan did on Saturday. They did over the last half of last year, and then against Minnesota as well. They just seem to be making their own lives easier with some of their play calls and some of their easy yards that they're able to pick up now that it seemed like for a couple of years that they never ever did. But Ohio State and Clemson are probably the two best thieves of yardage in college football. Alabama just goes deep, but Clemson and Ohio State seem to be really, really good at just randomly, as you said, picking up 6-8 yards here and there.
Oh, hey, and because you teased the article that you're working on, but I didn't give you an actual chance to preview it. If you want to, what are you finding as far as underperformers, overperformers for the listeners out there? Listen, nobody's necessarily listening to me to make bets. I hope maybe they glean something here or there. So that's not necessarily the nature of this show, but I'm sure there's more than a few football fans out there listening to this who put a ducat or two down on a Saturday. So again, if you want to tease your article, which will be up on ESPN, ESPN.com, what you finding?
I think the biggest finding is don't bet on Georgia Tech games, LSU games, or Air Force games. Okay. That's the biggest because Georgia Tech is going to get its butt kicked about 2/3 of the time and then overachieve by about 3 touchdowns against the spread the other third of the time. LSU has been doing the same thing where they alternate between suffering terribly disappointing losses and then blowing a team out more than you even thought they were going to. And Air Force is, 2 games with very, very different impressions there. So, it was kind of that who's reliable, who can we kind of trust? Like Tulane has been a really funny team this year in that they're constantly either on a run or giving up a run, but at the end of 60 minutes, their result is pretty much exactly what the spread said it would be. So that's been kind of fun to follow. But yeah, the major thing is like Georgia Tech and LSU and Air Force have been hilariously volatile this year. So if you're wanting to put money on a known entity, do not put money on them. Yeah,
Tulane has been a wild ride this year, but it always sort of ends in the same place, right?
Yeah, no, it's been crazy. They were supposed to beat South Alabama by a little, and then they decided to fall behind by 18 and win by 3. They were supposed to beat Navy by a little, and then they went up 24-0 and gave up 27 straight. They were supposed to lose to Houston, and they did so after starting up 17. They went on a 52-3 run against Southern Miss. They've been crazy, but aside from the Southern Miss results, everything was like, yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so you mentioned Michigan a little bit and the easy yards there. It's only one game. Another thing you wrote for ESPN.com was your wild overreactions from the first weekend of the Big Ten. And Michigan is a wild overreaction team. We are always going to amplify whatever Michigan does in one particular game. The other thing is they played another ostensibly good team. I think most of us seem to think Minnesota is going to be pretty good. I'm a little less enthusiastic about Minnesota because I'm always a little less enthusiastic about the breakthrough team from the year before.
Right.
I'm a person who believes you believe in numbers. I believe in history, right? History tells me Minnesota doesn't have 2 years like that 2 years in a row like that. Not since, Bernie Bierman, I think it was. Back in the 40s. So I will always tend to default to sort of what your history is, which means that I kind of looked at Minnesota this year and thought, yeah, probably went, well, in a normal year, eight, maybe get to 9. Whereas last year they were into double digits. Regardless, then they also had some issues with COVID, or it looks like they were missing players. Let's put it that way. And we believe that might be some COVID
2020 terminology. Yes.
Yeah.
They were without a handful of players for unspecified reasons.
Exactly. So, okay, long-winded way of me saying that we put a lot of emphasis on that Michigan game. Can I be excited about Michigan? Am I allowed to? Like, I kind of like half was excited about Michigan on Twitter on Saturday and immediately got yelled at by Twitter followers about overrating Michigan again. So I don't know. Like, can I be a little excited about Michigan? Why beyond Saturday am I allowed to be a little excited about Michigan's offense?
Well, the first thing is that, you get yelled at for saying anything nice about Michigan because on Twitter, they are exactly like Texas, exactly like USC, exactly like Miami. We always overrate these teams. They always disappoint. But here's the deal. Michigan's been way better than Texas and Miami and and Nebraska and USC and all the other teams we supposedly boost all the time. They were a spot away from the 2016 playoff most likely, and they've won double-digit games since then. They've been top 10 SP plus since then. They had a fall off there for a little bit last year. And I think the biggest thing with Michigan is they always finish poorly. They always look like a top 10 team, didn't get their butts kicked by Ohio State, then lose their bowl. And that's why we put them in the same category. But on average, they are better than those other teams. They have played elite or at least very close to elite football within the last 3, 4, 5 years. So, that's number one. They are different in that regard. But, if you're looking for reasons to tap your brakes, one of the reasons would be, number one, their defense kind of gave up quite a bit of ground to Minnesota. Like the pass rush looked good, but they gave up a couple big passes, and their ground game was very efficient for Minnesota, which is not really what you want to see. Not that there are amazing. Ohio State's ground game might not be amazing. Penn State has exploding drummer running backs at the moment. They're down to like one basically that isn't a freshman, but there were worries about the ground game, and then on offense, simply Minnesota's defense might be about the second worst they play this year. Maryland's is probably worse, but beyond that, we can't really. Michigan State's we don't really know, but Wisconsin's going to have a good defense. Penn State's going to have a good defense. Ohio State, Rutgers is probably going to have a competent defense. So what we saw might be kind of the high watermark. More teams, number one, have film to review, but number two, they just might have better defenses than Minnesota, and that could make a big difference as we go along here. But that said, they are second in success rate, my success rate measure after 1 week, because they were so dramatically efficient. The run game looked as good as you could possibly hope for it to. The passing game was fine. Milton wasn't really asked to do much there, but it worked to the extent that it needed to. It was the best case scenario for Michigan out of the gates, at least as far as the offense goes.
Do you think do your numbers suggest anything that supports what has been a little bit of a narrative this season? And the narrative so far is which is frankly, to me, it almost seems a little silly that this has been part of the narrative of the season, because offenses have been dominating defenses. We're on a 15-year run, a trajectory of this. Now, obviously, it's been even more pronounced in the last 5 to 7 years, but we're still talking about a 5 to 7 year trend of offenses blowing away defenses. And really, again, it goes back probably 15 years where offenses have started to really have just ticked up and up and up. But nonetheless, when it happens in the SEC, it gets a lot of attention. And when it happens to Alabama, it gets a lot of attention. Are your numbers lining up this year in a way that proves that, that we can now definitively say offense is more important than defense? Or have they been lining up that way for a while and now we're just sort of like taking it into the narrative?
Yeah, I think this is always going to be a pretty big narrative conversation as a rule, but scoring averages have gone up, and they've been pretty all over the place this year, but they were up, especially early in the year. And, just again, from a narrative perspective, like when I was writing my big preview for the Alabama-Georgia game, I was looking at all the times in history where the number one offense per my SP Plus rankings played the number one defense per SP Plus. And like it rarely happens. It was like 6 times in the last 75 years or whatever. But the 5 previous times before last year, the defensive team won. And usually that was either low scoring or kind of just the average of the day scoring. Last year, LSU scored 37 points on Georgia. Georgia had definitely pretty clearly had the best defense in the country last year. LSU puts up 37 points. Alabama then tops LSU this year in terms of points and yards per play against Georgia. Another, probably a better Georgia defense, more experienced anyway. that's a pretty good anecdote. That's you know, if scoring averages are going up and then you've got pretty good anecdotes to go with it, that's a pretty good case. It was fascinating hearing Nick Saban say all that last week, just about how, you know, you're going to have to outscore teams. That's just the way it is. But he's not wrong.
Yeah, I had an interesting thought that my friend Paul Meyerberg from USA Today imparted on me after last year's national championship game. I think I've used it on this podcast before, but I don't think I've used it with you, so I'll bring it up to you. And after what happened with LSU, what Paul said was, because, you know, we were talking about this unprecedented LSU offense and how we might never see anything like it again. And sort of Paul's take was this might be a bit of an outlier, but maybe this is also, we're going to see this again. What he suggested was, if you merge the talent in the SEC with the creativeness and innovation of offenses that has been sort of swirling around football, not just college football, but football in general. And now the best talent and the most creativity and innovation are merged. Like, this may become fairly normal. You know, again, maybe not to the extreme of 60 touchdowns, but I mean, look at the pace that Alabama, 60 touchdown passes. But then again, you look at the pace that Mac Jones is on, and you tell me, Bill, I mean, what does S&P look like when it comes to the number one offense in the country this year compared to what LSU was at last year?
I mean, Alabama's offense is at worst at like 2018 Oklahoma levels right now. And they are number one in offensive SP plus at the moment. But I mean, Florida's 6th, LSU's 15th. They're actually more top 15 offenses in the SEC than defenses. But I mean, I think we shouldn't also overlook that the conference as a whole has hired a lot of really good offensive coaches of late. You know, even if you don't count Joe Brady anymore from last year, Dan Mullen is a very proven offensive coach. He comes back to Florida, obviously from the SEC, but you brought in Mike Leach, who's, I mean, struggling a little, but he's still Mike Leach. You brought in Lane Kiffin. You brought in Eli Drinkwitz. There are a lot of, you know, Kendall Briles is at Arkansas. This conference as a whole has brought in a lot of very good offensive minds, and you know that's played an effect. Maybe the defensive minds haven't been as strong. I don't know, but just when you hire good offensive coaches, your point totals go up. So it could be as simple as that, while also then acknowledging that Alabama thinks offense is more important than defense and is ridiculously good at offense this year, and that helps the numbers too.
So we're gonna have a little news update here during the because there's a whole bunch of stuff flying around. So I'm going to take you to a little news desk here. And then we'll take a quick break, and then we'll finish up with Bill. As we are speaking, James Franklin said Noah Cain is now out for the season. So absolutely, Penn State's running back room has been devastated because Journey Brown, they're still sort of holding out hope that maybe he will come back. Though that's not necessarily looking great. And now Noah Cain is out. So there's some talent there, but it's very young. And, you know, maybe it's now Devin Ford who scored the accidental touchdown. So Penn State has some issues. There's also some reports going around that Graham Mertz, the Wisconsin quarterback who had tested positive for COVID, that there was going to be a follow-up test. And now there's some reporting out there that follow-up test has also tested positive. So that means in the Big Ten, that means he is gone for 21 days. And we can argue, or others, I'm not going to, others can argue and gnash their teeth about that rule, because otherwise he would be out probably about 10 days, depending on how he's feeling, 10 to maybe 14 days. But he's going to be out 21 days. So those are two pretty significant developments within the Big Ten. The other little bit of news is that Southern Miss is now on its third coach of the season, because this has nothing to do with COVID, but Scotty Walden, who was promoted to the interim after Jay Hobson resigned following the first game of the season, got all that. Now Scotty Walden is leaving to go to Austin Peay, effective immediately, right? Like, so again, this is a weird season. That's the news. We're going to take a quick break with Bill Connelly from ESPN. Come back, wrap up, get his thoughts on the weekend and a couple of teams that his SP plus numbers hate.
Hey, it's Michael Rosenbaum. You may remember me as Lex Luthor from the hit TV show Smallville. Regardless, I have this really cool podcast called Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum, where I get celebrities who are a lot more famous than me to really open up. Let's get inside of Jim Jeffries.
Oh, I never did anything with my life. I could have been a better son. Oh, God. I should apologize to this person.
So, join me on Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum. New episodes drop every Tuesday. Listen on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your shows.
We're back on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast with Bill Connelly from ESPN. So, Bill, again, a lot of news going on there, but I want to take you back to your rankings for a second and ask you, why do you hate Kansas State, Bill?
It has been good. It's deflected the attention that Wake Forest fans were giving me for why my numbers hate their team. But Kansas State, it is funny. I have a history with Kansas State. Back in like the super early days of SP Plus, before the ampersand was removed for reasons. The 2011, what is that, a 10 or 11 win Kansas State team ranked 40th in SP Plus. I don't remember, like I've altered the formula since then, but no matter how many tweaks I make to the formula, my numbers still hate that 2011 team. And because I was, a Mizzou blogger at that point and writing a bunch about the Big 12, I got to interact with a lot of Kansas State fans who were pretty mad about that. And so basically, anytime my numbers don't completely respect Kansas State, we're fighting 2011 all over again. We're fighting 2011 this year because Kansas State is right now 66th in SP Plus, despite being 4-1 and I guess 4-0 in the Big 12, and 0-1 in the Sun Belt. So they're 66. That is 8th in the Big 12, a little bit behind a TCU team that they didn't look amazing beating, but they beat. And then they're ahead of two other teams they beat, Texas Tech and Kansas. Didn't look amazing against Texas Tech either. But I looked each Sunday now when I put out my SP Plus rankings. I look at the biggest movers and the biggest droppers and all that, and then I also pick a team to address why do my numbers hate your team. Kansas State is a couple things. Number one, they lost to Arkansas State, and Arkansas State continues to drop in the rankings and kind of drags down in Kansas State with them a little bit. They are now 82nd in SP Plus, and it wasn't just like a fluky Penn State versus Indiana loss. They lost to Arkansas State. They're kind of lucky to be as close as they were to Arkansas State. So that's going to drag them down a little bit. And the other thing was, they've beaten. We'll talk about the Oklahoma game in a minute, but they've beaten TCU, Texas Tech, and Kansas, the three worst teams in the conference, not named Kansas State, according to the numbers. And they only looked like a top 50 team in beating TCU and Tech. It was kind of by decent margins, but not maybe as much as they should have been if they're going to be the best team in the conference, apparently. So they're not getting a lot of credit for those wins. They walloped Kansas, but you don't get any credit for walloping Kansas. You're expected to wallop Kansas, I guess. Kansas is currently 119th in SP Plus. They continue to figure out ways to get worse. And so really the only reason that they would be in the top 50 or so is the Oklahoma win. But my numbers didn't really like the Oklahoma win either. They saw that as kind of a game that Oklahoma wins two out of three or 3 out of 4 times. So, because this is Kansas State, because Bill Snyder had some wizard moments, we are in a narrative of SP Plus just doesn't measure Kansas State right, and maybe that's true. They've definitely improved since Arkansas State, but they're also not all that proven. They rely on special teams returns and preventing big plays and trying to get 3 big plays out of Deuce Vaughn instead of 1 in a given game. And it's worked so far, but that doesn't mean it's going to keep working the rest of the year.
Yeah, it is interesting because I was looking, even if you look at their traditional numbers, nothing particular other than the fact that, again, Deuce Vaughn, a running back, is averaging like 26 yards a catch. But there's very few things about Kansas State that stand out where you say, oh, they're doing this really, really well. Well, they're doing special teams, it looks like, quite well.
Yep.
They're not even milking the clock in some ways like they have in the past, because I know that's generally they want to sort of play a little slow and limit possessions. That's always been a great strategy for them to counteract a Big 12 where everybody's going fast, is to sort of condense the game a little bit and take some possessions out. And ultimately, Chris Kleiman, I think, wants to do that, but it's not like when you look at their raw numbers, they've done that particularly well this year. It is that they're a weird team, and whatever voodoo magic that Bill Snyder had at his peak, it is amazing that they have found a coach who is able to sort of take that blueprint to a certain degree and replicate it in a way.
Yeah, I mean, basically against two bad teams, two pretty mediocre teams, and one good team, they've averaged 6.1 yards per play, and they've allowed 5.6 yards per play, which isn't great, especially when a lot of those offensive yards are coming in huge chunks while battling inefficiency elsewhere. Now, it is funny. I mean, this is where kind of having your numbers and having a system that gets you yelled at a lot isn't very fun, because this is a really fun story. This is a 4-0. This team is leading at this point. If they split against Iowa State and Oklahoma State, if they can avoid, maybe they can afford one other loss along the way, as long as they split those games for tiebreaker purposes. Kind of looks this is a pretty high possibility of a Big 12 title game appearance right here, and that's a cool story. And I have to hate it because I get yelled at a lot.
And also to give you again an idea of where Bill's numbers are, where SP Plus is, and where Vegas is. The last I looked, Kansas State is an underdog at West Virginia this week. It was, I believe they were getting 3. Now that may have changed. Again, there's a lot of news going on as we're doing this podcast.
I reference that sometimes. It's like, yeah, my numbers hate your team, but so does Vegas, and people seem to think Vegas knows what it's doing. So maybe there's something to it.
Let me sort of end on this, Bill. And that is the idea. I feel like we have been in this for the last couple of years, this area of there are 3 great teams, and we're just sort of sitting around waiting to see if any of those 3 great teams lose. And that's it. And like, in other words, as far as the playoff, there's sort of 3 teams that control that whole thing. And maybe we should get a little enjoyment out of the rest of college football, because if you're just focusing on the playoff, there are just 3 teams there. It sort of looks like SP Plus agrees with that. Yeah. Where do you stand on the 3-tiered superpower of Clemson, Bama, Ohio State? It's actually Ohio State. In your numbers, it's actually Ohio State, Clemson, Alabama. But nonetheless, no matter what order you put them in, that seems to be where the line of demarcation is on who's great in college football. Do you see any places where... Well, I shouldn't say do you see any places where they could stumble, because Ohio State, I guess, could stumble this weekend, and Penn State. But are you seeing what are your numbers basically seeing what I think we're all seeing, which is there are 3 teams and everybody else? Yeah,
I mean, right now, Ohio State, I think, I'm blanking on the odds, but Ohio State and Alabama have very good odds of at worst finishing with 1 loss and probably winning the conference title game and moving on. Clemson's odds aren't quite as good, just because my numbers do like Notre Dame a decent amount. And so once they clear that hurdle, the numbers will look great for them, but they do have to clear that hurdle. But no, I mean, yeah, there's right now there is a 5-point difference between Ohio State, Clemson, and Alabama in SP Plus, which I present as like an adjusted points per game figure. But within below Alabama, you've got Wisconsin, who, again, after one brilliant performance, is actually within 1.3 points of the top 3, which is something. I can't imagine it stays there now. You've got Georgia 4 points behind Bama. You've got Florida 3 points behind Georgia. And then you've got kind of the pack from there. There's big separation, in other words. The separation between Ohio State and Georgia is 9.2 points. The separation between Georgia and, let's see, number 20 Boise State is 9.3 points. So there, it is a different tier. And I say that even though I said at the top, this is kind of a normal distribution. Things aren't quite as funky as they maybe seem in that middle ground, in that 5 to 15 range. It's only normal because we're used to the top 3 being ahead of everybody else. And it seems to be the case again. So I'm going to tell you to take your scientist hat off and just put your writer and lover of college football hat on.
how do you appreciate, have you had to convince yourself to sort of appreciate the season beyond the playoff? Maybe it's easy for you, but I kind of feel like I need to talk to fans about this more and more. That like, yes, we're going to talk a lot about the playoff because we like to talk a lot about the playoff, but really you have to learn to enjoy the season for things that have nothing to do with the playoff, because really there are only, I think, 3 teams, maybe 4. Right. I might throw Georgia in there still. I think there are really only 3 or 4 teams that have a chance of winning the national championship. So if you're viewing everything through who's going to make the playoff and who's going to win your national championship, we could stop everything right now, not worry about playing through a pandemic, and just have Clemson, Ohio State, Alabama, and a team to be named later thrown in there. So how do you enjoy the rest of the season, Bill?
Well, I mean, we've certainly gotten practice at this. The last couple of years have been quite chalky too, at the top. And, what I always say is the good thing about college football is, there's always weird stuff going on. You just might have to dig for it a little bit. As long as you're willing to dig, it's great. You have to dig kind of far the last couple of years. And then this year there isn't as far to dig because we don't have some crazy D2 playoff game, being played as a train goes by in the middle of the afternoon, and, all sorts of, I fell in love with the Division II playoffs last year and 3. And so those don't exist at the moment. But we have had upsets. We have had that Indiana Penn State game was absolutely incredible. We've had, weird, the Alabama Ole Miss game. We've had upsets. We've had things to keep track of. And that's good. I mean, the divisive approach that this sport saw back in July and August when it came time to figure out scheduling and everything else, or not divisive, but divided, I guess. Like I was madder and more frustrated with this sport than I think I've ever been for the entire months of July and August. It was so frustrating to watch everybody to watch college football act like itself and not raise its game, not figure out how to work together, not do any of that. Just everybody continues in their own silos and works opposite of each other and competes against each other and everything else. It was very disheartening to see all that. And once the game started, that helped a little bit, but we've had just enough funky games to kind of entertain ourselves as we go along here, which is good because the playoff race is not all that impressive right now. We're just waiting to see if Georgia beats Alabama the second time, and if they don't, can Notre Dame beat Clemson? And if they can't, then I have no idea who's number 4. BYU maybe.
Well, we could stump for BYU. I'd be fine with doing that. Bill Connelly from ESPN. He is the brains behind SP Plus. I am a big fan of SP Plus. Listen, I love the AP rankings, which is very subjective. But I also always, when I'm looking after the AP rankings, if the voters vote on the weekend, I always sort of break out SP Plus and look and see how the voters do compare to SP Plus and why maybe things are different and why they are the same. I'm a big fan of Bill and his work. Seek him out if you can. Bill, thank you so much. Enjoy your big football weekend, and we'll maybe circle back around on you in a couple of months to see what the numbers say about the postseason.
Sounds good.
And now, 3 and out. First down. So there was a lot of news during the recording of the show, as we went over with Bill. Most importantly, that Wisconsin redshirt freshman quarterback Graham Mertz, who was near perfect in his starting debut last week against Illinois, will indeed be out for a while because of a COVID-19 positive test. People will complain about the Big Ten's 21-day rule. No other conference is taking an approach that is so cautious. Other doctors I have talked to have said that what the Big Ten is doing is quote unquote reasonable, but they prefer to take a more case-by-case approach where some might need more time to return and other players less time. I spoke to Ohio State's team physician last week about the Big Ten's 21-day return to play approach. Dr. Jim Borchers played a pivotal role in getting the Big Ten season up and running after it initially postponed. He said the 21-day return to play protocol was what was needed to convince Big Ten presidents and chancellors to have a season. And I have no reason not to believe him. I also asked him if having such a conservative return to the field timeline was a way of getting coaches and players to take protocols meant to prevent getting infected more seriously. It's easy to forget this because the players mostly shrug off the virus, at least in the short term. But from a doctor's point of view, the goal is to prevent infections. Though I would argue that message probably hasn't been taken seriously at every program throughout the country. Borcher said, no, the 21-day rule was not meant to sort of scare the players and coaches into taking COVID seriously, but he did admit that might be a byproduct. And if it is, that's not necessarily a bad thing because the goal, again, is to not get infected. But I'll add one more thing. I'm not here to shame the players and coaches or anyone for that matter who does catch COVID. Speaking just about my area of expertise, college football, there is a ton of effort being made and being put into trying to prevent players from getting infected and trying to avoid outbreaks. It's a lot of work and it costs a lot of money. But with the pandemic pretty much raging around most of the country, it's really hard for these programs to keep COVID away from their teams. They're just not getting a lot of help from the rest of the country. Second down and back to fun and games to tie up another loose end we mentioned while talking to Bill. Think about where Penn State was in the backfield a year ago. The Nittany Lions were so loaded with Noah Cain and Journey Brown that former 5-star recruit Ricky Slade transferred to ODU in the offseason. Now, Cain is out and Brown probably isn't coming back because of a medical condition that he's been dealing with. Here's the one bit of good news. There is a reason why NFL teams have devalued running backs. There are a lot of talented players in the pipeline at that position. Penn State leaned on Devin Ford last week, and he was okay despite scoring that ill-advised touchdown. He was also a former 4-star recruit. The guy I'd keep an eye on is a freshman. We got to see him a little bit last week against Indiana. Kevon Lee, a 230-pounder from Florida, looked pretty darn good to me. That might be the player who emerges from all this. Listen, it's not good to lose players like Brown and Cain, especially with Ohio State coming to town on Saturday. But good programs usually have multiple good options at running back. Maybe some need a little more seasoning than others. Penn State might be able to come through this okay in the long run, though in the short term, it's not looking great. Third down. This definitely sets up as a calm before the storm weekend in college football, though I guess you could say that might be the case in general in this country. Glancing ahead to next week, apparently there is some really big news going on Tuesday in college football. On Wednesday, there's a full slate of MAC games, the first games of the season in that conference. There are multiple games on Thursday and Friday night, including BYU at Boise State, which sets up to be the biggest game of the year for BYU. Saturday looks like it should have, and that's Saturday, November 7th, looks like it should have at least 4 matchups of ranked teams, including Clemson at Notre Dame, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma State, Kansas State. That is if Kansas State can beat West Virginia this week. I'm already getting fired up for November 7th. That's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Sarah McCrory, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Westwood One Podcast. Please subscribe so you do not miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening. Come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.